1934, and Adolf Hitler has been in power as Chancellor for a little over a year. In this time, he'd done an effective job turning Germany into the talk of the world, though not all those speaking offered praise. The mood amongst the Western powers was shifting rapidly away from his curious ambivalence and toward fear. Hitler spoke of rearming Germany more often and more fervently, and despite assurances from German diplomats to the contrary, attacks on foreigners by the Gestapo and brown shirts had not abated. Yet, all was not well or settled for the Hitler government, as recounted by American Ambassador Dr. James Dodd, who wrote to the Secretary of State saying, quote, "Everywhere I go, people talk of resistance, of possible putsches in the big cities." End quote. Ambassador Dodd's appraisal of the situation was more than hopeful speculation, as vocal opponents to Nazism seemed to be rising in tandem alongside more aggressive bids to secure power by the Hitler government. The Enabling Act of 1933 followed in the wake of a decadent ceremony in Potsdam in which Hitler feigned loyalty to President Hindenburg before donning a brown shirt uniform and forcing the Enabling Act through the Reichstag 2 days later. This sharp turn from respectable appearances to dictatorial aggression hadn't gone unnoticed by the German public. Following the passage of the Enabling Act, the Nazi government made swift efforts at ensuring their power by outlawing or abusing other political parties. Arresting political opponents was the language of the day. Even here, Hitler had to stay his hand from his most daring plays. President Hindenburg could dismiss him at will, and had the loyalty of the army to enforce that decision if needed. The Reichswehr's support of Hitler was middling at best, and many army officers feared the chaos an uncontested SA could wreak if Hitler was granted any more power. Moreover, the trade unions were broadly opposed to Hitler and stacked with Social Democrats, and should they organize against him, they could grind the German economy to a halt through mass strikes. Should this happen, it would only invite further scrutiny from the other Western powers, and perhaps force President Hindenburg's hand. It is here, then, that Hitler had to prepare his next move in securing absolute power: usurp President Hindenburg to protect his position as Chancellor, quell the threat posed by organized labor, and bring the army to heel. The Nazis moved swiftly in their bid to undermine the power of the trade unions, or rather, to coordinate them along the same lines of social revolution they were already deploying elsewhere. Joseph Goebbels, ever the artist of appearances, offered to honor May Day as a national holiday in celebration of the German worker. This move was hailed as a major, if only symbolic, step forward for organized labor under the Nazi government, and the Nazis had a day of celebrations and festivities planned to usher in their unification with the labor movement. However, beneath the surface of this massive gathering of more than 1 million working-class Germans in Potsdam, methods of quiet coercion were underway. Workers had their time cards confiscated, and were instructed they could only collect them by attending the May Day celebration. Others were threatened with dismissal if they did not attend. Alongside all of it was the general understanding that the invitation was not optional, and that any absence from the festivities might be seen as a show of disloyalty that the SA would be keen to snuff. Labor leaders likely suspected that by playing along with the Nazis, they could maintain some level of independence, but Joseph Goebbels had other plans. For the propaganda minister, the coordination of May Day was only one step of his much larger design. He writes, quote, "On May 2nd the trade union offices will be occupied. There might be a row for a few days, but then they will belong to us. We must make no allowances anymore. Once the trade unions are in our hands, the other parties and organizations will not be able to hold out much longer." End quote. With labor offices secured, the muscle of the Social Democrats evaporated. In June of 1933, the Social Democrat Party was ordered disbanded, and its elected leaders were no longer allowed their seats in government at any level. Shortly thereafter, some 3,000 Social Democrat functionaries were arrested and hauled off to concentration camps. Following these sanctioned arrests were less than sanctioned acts of violence by the brown shirts, who rounded up, tortured, and killed Social Democrats unfortunate enough to get in their way. In Köpenick, nearly 100 Social Democrats were tortured and murdered. In Durgoy, the brown shirts opened a makeshift concentration camp in which they made a game out of abusing the Social Democrats hauled inside. Within days, the Bavarian People's Party had been banned and its members arrested, as well as many members of the Center Party. Shortly thereafter, the Communist Party was outlawed and arrests of its members began as well. In less than a month, and in one clean sweep, the Nazi Party had gutted any legitimate political opposition and devoured organized labor into itself. The remainder of 1933 was filled with mass efforts at coordination, as the Nazi state sought to bring the whole of German society into line with its values. This was markedly easier during the latter half of the year, as any political opposition to the party was literally impossible, and any symbolic, public displays of resistance were met with immediate violence from the brown shirts. Yet, this crackdown gave the German military establishment pause, and even as Hitler solved the problem of the troublesome labor movement, he only increased his opposition from the military. Ernst Röhm, head of the Brown Shirts, was the locus of the army's ire. Here was a man totally despised by the German army, whose brown shirts had been a continual source of embarrassment and frustration. The officer corps saw him and his lackeys as pretenders who played soldier dress-up instead of being real soldiers. So long as the army was loyal to President Hindenburg, and Röhm their least favorite man on earth, Hitler would have difficulty assuming the total power he wanted. Then came a moment that could have, possibly, changed the fate of the entire world. In June of 1934, Vice-Chancellor von Papen was on a train heading for Marburg, where he was to deliver a banal speech at the public university there. However, his speechwriter, Edgar Jung, and his secretary, Fritz von Tschirschky, had other plans. They had been painstakingly at work preparing a wholly different speech for him. Tschirschky writes, quote, "It took months of preparation. It was necessary to find the proper occasion for its delivery, and then everything had to be prepared with the greatest possible care." The two men cornered Papen on the train and, in their own words, quote, "forced him to give the speech." Their pressure was backed up with the fact that some, or perhaps all, of its contents had already been leaked and would circulate as Papen's words if he gave the speech or not. Papen's speech denounced the, quote, "selfishness, the lack of principle, the insincerity, the unchivalrous behavior, and the arrogance," end quote, of the Nazi government. He plowed ahead, likely checking every shadow for an SS trooper who would snatch him up on his way out the door. Papen reached his crescendo, demanding it was time to, quote, "silence doctrinaire fanatics." Unexpectedly, the room erupted in applause, and a confused, terrified Papen left the stage. One can imagine he didn't get much sleep that night, and checked for brown shirts under his bed for days afterwards. Coincidentally, Hitler had a speech on the same day, and likely caught wind of Papen's verbal betrayal. He stated, quote, "If they should attempt to move from their criticism to a new act of perjury, they can be sure that what confronts them today is not the corrupt bourgeois of 1918, but the fist of the entire people." Hitler's threat was made, directed at Papen and any of his potential allies. Yet, if all Hitler had was words in response to such a brazen act of defiance, then the myth of his uncontestable power might crack. Naturally, Goebbels suppressed circulation of Papen's speech as an act of damage control. It is here, in the days that followed, where the unlikely hero of Vice-Chancellor Papen almost stopped the Nazis cold, averted the Holocaust, and spared humanity from the Second World War. Almost. In a fit of uncharacteristic bravery, Papen went to Hitler and demanded his speech be returned to the press, and threatened to go to President Hindenburg and resign if his demands were not met. This, of course, was a threat. If the speech circulated in the press, it would rouse the nascent opposition to the Hitler government around Germany and position Papen as its figurehead. Here, a man too insulated to arrest or kill would become the mouthpiece of anti-Hitler sentiments around the world. If it didn't, Papen could have Hitler sacked then and there. Papen and Hindenburg had a long working relationship, and Papen believed that if he insisted Hitler be deposed, then Hindenburg would oblige him. Hitler parried the threat with an offer to accompany Papen so all three men could sort things out together. With Hitler present at the meeting, he could remind Hindenburg of his utility in defeating the political left and bringing the labor movement into the right-wing fold. As far as the aged Hindenburg knew, that meant Hitler defeated the left on his behalf and delivered him the loyalty of organized labor to boot. Papen had lost this round, but was unaware of what that loss would mean for him, for Germany, for the millions of people whose lives would be churned up by the Hitler government. Later that night, at a state-sponsored funeral for the wife of a ranking Nazi official, Heinrich Himmler pulled Hitler aside and, in a single conversation, sealed the fate of 75 million people. He lied, claiming that someone tried to assassinate him. Not just someone, but brown shirt leader Ernst Röhm. The two men's heated rivalry for who ruled the ranks of the Nazi paramilitary forces had only risen in intensity over the last year, and it was running afoul of Himmler's plans to subsume the Nazi state into the SS. More than that, Himmler had a personal hatred for Röhm, grounded in his own homophobia and jealousy of Röhm's prior military service in the regular army. Himmler declared that brown shirts were in league with Papen to overthrow the Hitler government, and that Adolf should move to stop them. Over the course of their conversation, Hitler realized what the pretext of stopping a coup could mean for him. He could court the favor of the army officer corps by dealing with Röhm, permanently secure the loyalty of the SS, and snuff the last grasp of legitimate political opposition in one move. It was too delicious to ignore. On June 30th, Hitler himself led several cars of armed SS men to Hotel Hanselbauer, where Röhm and other brown shirt leaders lay sleeping. The SS burst in with guns drawn and dragged Röhm outside, informing him that he had been caught red-handed in an act of treason. Hitler ordered 6 executions of ranking brown shirts, then placed Berlin under martial law. Within hours, roadblocks manned by the SS were set up, and a cacophony of violence played out in the streets. SS death squads roved the city. dragging suspected dissidents and co-conspirators in the imaginary Rom coup into protective custody in the SS barracks. Gunfire cracked from the building as the incoming detainees were put against the wall and shot almost as soon as they arrived. While the Nazi government claimed that fewer than 50 traitors were killed, witnesses reported hearing gunfire, quote, day and night, and American Ambassador James Dodd estimates the number was closer to 500. No official, accurate records exist. Of those 500, one stands out as the most significant. Ernst Röhm was taken to an isolated prison cell, and after hours of waiting was presented a pistol with a single bullet and instructed to kill himself. He ripped his uniform coat open, displaying his bare chest, and demanded that if Hitler wanted him dead, he could do it himself. The SS men shot him. Röhm, architect of the Nazi ground game during the Weimar years, head of the paramilitary squad that united so many right-wing militias under its banner, and Hitler loyalist and confidant to the end, had been killed once he outlived his usefulness. Von Papen, as well as much of his staff, were taken into custody. Among the arrested was Edgar Jung. He was taken to a Gestapo basement and shot for his role in Papen's defiant speech. From this point forward, Papen would play the coward. He accepted a job as a German ambassador to Austria, and in his assignment, Hitler could rid himself of such a troublesome opponent without risking any international backlash that might result if he had him killed. Heinrich Himmler, ever the manipulator of Nazism behind the scenes, had achieved his aims with far greater success than he could have hoped for. Röhm was dead, and with him the cantankerous brown shirts were dealt with. Papen, Hitler's last serious opponent in the Reichstag, was out of the way, and Himmler's own position as a loyal servant to the cause was secure. The timing couldn't have been better. In August, President Hindenburg died of natural causes, and Adolf Hitler assumed his powers. In one clean, easy sweep, Adolf Hitler had dissolved the Reichstag and assumed total command of the civilian government and the armed forces, complete with the authority to rule by decree. Meanwhile, in the same motion, Heinrich Himmler had usurped his rivals inside the party and positioned himself as the head of Nazism's reorganized paramilitary wing. In the coming years, Himmler will flex his newfound muscle through the rapid development of an ever-expanding concentration camp system that will consume 17 million lives before it is done. As always, I am so thankful for your time and participation in this video. If you enjoyed the content or got something from it, then please like and subscribe, and you can find my science fiction novel, The Night Sky Darker, on Amazon if you would like to support in that way. I would like to end by offering extra special thanks to my subscribers on Patreon, whose monthly contributions are an excellent help to me personally and make content like this possible. Thank y'all so much.